Michael Hichborn, thank you so much for joining me today. It's really great to see you again. We met a couple of months ago in America, that a wonderful conference. Not all my listeners, my readers, are going to know who you are. So I wonder if you'd take a few moments to, first of all, describe the Lepanto Institute we're going to talk about, the way in which you keep the bishops in the United States clean, or try to. And then I'm going to ask you how you came to found it. And then we'll get to the meat of what we're going to do, which is to talk about your latest report, which is very powerful, very helpful. Michael, what's the Lepanto Institute?
So the Lepanto Institute, I set it up 10 years ago in 2015 when I had been working for American Life League and I was conducting all kinds of research into the Campaign for Human Development, Catholic Relief Services, several other organizations claiming to be Catholic. And through the course of these investigations, we discovered that there were serious problems going on with Catholic charitable organizations all over the world. I subsequently found problems with Malteser International, which is run by the Knights of Malta. We discovered very serious problems with Caritas Internationalis, which is the Vatican's agency for international aid and development groups. I looked into CAFOD. I've looked into Troker and Court Aid and all sorts of other international aid and development groups. And consistently, we find the same problems over and over and over. They're collaborating with the enemies of the church. So as I was working at American Life League, it came to pass that the investigations I was conducting were beyond the scope of the mission of the organization, and we decided to mutually part, where I would do this full time on my own and conduct these investigations and help to bring a greater light to the very serious problems that are facing the church in this realm.
Because it's crazy for us to voluntarily support progressive and politically far left campaigns, and this was all taking place because there was inadequate monitoring going on. There wasn't sufficient accountability. Is this conspiracy or just ineptitude?
I wish it was just conspiracy because that would be so much easier to explain away. But it's a combination of things, and ultimately, I think what happened is that over the course of the last 120 years or so, modernism has so crept into the church that the ideologies of individual Catholics has shifted away from the work of salvation, whether it's working for our own salvation, the salvation of our families, the salvation of our communities, and has turned into a materialistic form of salvation. We need to fight for this right and fight for that right and get involved in this march and get involved in that march. And it's all about social justice, which has its place in some respects, but when it becomes your ultimate focus and you start to view fixing the world as opposed to fixing souls, therein lies the problem. And that's ultimately, I think, what's happened to the church over the last 120 years. And because of that, you have kind of a combination. You've got individuals who are dyed-in-the-wool Marxists. Okay, these are people that believe that we have to radically change the world. We have to have revolution. And through that revolutionary mindset, they will collaborate with others of a similar mindset. They'll even, in some respects, conspire in secret and say, well, we need to make sure that this gets passed. So I'm going to do this and you do that. We'll do it all in secret just to make sure it happens. Okay, so in that sense, you can say, yeah, there is a conspiratorial mindset, but it's merely collaboration behind doors, which happens everywhere. So you get that level of it, but then you also have just kind of the dupes that get the soft messaging in the pews, and they go, oh, well, we just need to help this and we need to help that, and yay for the environment, and so they get inculcated in this ideology that says we have to be focused on the world and worry about the world, and they eventually miss the forest for the trees because they're so focused on this issue and that issue, they lose sight of salvation. And so that's ultimately the problem that I think we're facing.
That's very interesting. I've seen three elements, I think, that I find it helpful. One is the fact that I've always thought that life in the spirit is a bit like a radar system or a GPS. You've either got it switched on or you've got it switched off. I mean, clearly there are bits, but there are lots of people with it switched off, and they don't get the life in the spirit, that the soul is the bit that is most important. And then the other part of it seemed to me to be that people like being nice, and they there's some kind of social kudos in being seen to be nice. It shores up your own sense of moral virtue. And the last one's more of a biblical theological one. I've always been attracted to the idea, and of course we don't know this for sure, but one of the reasons that Judas did what he did was that he was less convinced about the eschatological side of our Lord's ministry, and he wanted kind of, zealot action now, the kind of arch political activist, and thought perhaps that by bouncing Jesus into arrest, he would have to bring some kind of miraculous. And now it's just a theological strand that makes sense of part of the tension of betrayal in the apostolic vow. But I thought that these three elements, the lack of spiritual radar, trying to show yourself up by being seen as nice, and committing yourself to the full-on Marxist, we need change now, that this is part of the gravitational pull on people away from the pure focus of the salvation of souls. Can you add anything to that, or do you have any commentary on it? How do you see the dichotomy between doing it the world's way and doing it Christ's way?
So what St. Paul was saying in his epistle, he identified those whom he called the enemies of the cross of Christ. He said their end is destruction. Their God is their belly. He said their glory is their shame, and they mind earthly things. Now, what's interesting about that is that every single element of the Marxist movement, whether we're talking about socialists or outright communists, they all fall under the same banner. Because in the first respect, actually, we'll get to the first respect last, because I think it kind of encapsulates everything else. It starts with their God is their belly. In socialism, in Marxism, the idea is that everything has to do with the world. Everything's mundane and material, and you have to make sure that everybody has an abundance of everything, and you have to share everything in common, and there is no individual possession. So what they're saying is we have to work so that we can only consume. And so our God is our belly. We're all about consuming and producing so that we can consume. That's the first step. Their God is their belly. Their glory is in their shame. In this respect, what we're talking about is kind of like the pride movement. You have the individuals who put on very shameful displays, whether it's in parades or in story hours at the library, if you get my meaning. It's very shameful, but they take pride in it, and they exalt that shameful behavior as if it was a good thing, as if it's something to take pride in. They mind earthly things. So, in other words, their mind is not on spiritual matters. Their mind is not on salvation. Their mind is not on fostering and building and maintaining that relationship that we're supposed to have with Christ. Instead, their mind is simply on the material realm. How do we make sure that we take care of this? And how do we make sure that we take care of that? And how do we manage this and manage that? And so they're so enamored and focused on the world that they completely lose sight of spiritual realities, whether it's morality or just theological truths, and fostering that loving relationship with God that we're supposed to have. Now, what happens with all of that is that the end necessarily is destruction, because our Lord made it very clear that where your heart is, there also is your treasure. If your heart is in salvation, if your heart is in heaven, then your treasure is also there, and or vice versa. Your treasure is in heaven, then your heart is also there, and because of that, you'll be focused on maintaining that, and you'll have an eternal treasure that you're working toward. Whereas, if your idea is on things that are passing, if your heart is set on the mundane and the things that come and go, well, then your treasury is going to also fall away, because there's nothing eternal to maintain it. So socialism is that rejection of the cross, because it says that the greatest evil, the greatest sin to befall man is suffering. And it's just like what Dismas or Gestas at the at Calvary said, take us down from this cross. Or what the hecklers said at Calvary, if you're God, come down from the cross. They all wanted him to come down from the cross. But Christ, who was called by Dismas turned to him and said, Lord, our suffering is just, but your suffering is unjust. And please remember me when you enter into your kingdom. And it was through that recognition that we must suffer, and we suffer equally, whether we embrace the cross or not. We suffer equally. But it's that embrace of the cross that does lead to heaven. So we have to have our sights set on eternal truths. We have to have our sights set on love of God. And through that, our end is not destruction. Whereas on the other side, you have Gestas, the bad thief, and his end was destruction because he had no mind or no heart or no sight on eternal truths.
Well, that's a good spiritual diagnosis and a political one. They go hand in hand. So you're saying there's a secularism that's dominating the church, and the secularism is rooted in a spiritual antipathy. What kind of proportion of the episcopate suffer from this suboptimal spirituality?
Well, I think that the ratio of the episcopacy at the Passion is probably the same. So 1/12 of all the apostles was at the foot of the cross. 1/12 betrays Christ, or actually, it would be 2/12, so a sixth, because both Peter and Judas, in some respect, betrayed Christ directly, and some theologians even say that Peter's sin was greater than Judas's, because Peter's sin was the sin of apostasy, where he renounced Christ, whereas Judas merely betrayed him. But you have the other, 9, who simply run away. They're all cowards, and they won't stand up. They won't go and comfort our Lord, and they go and hide, and they remain hiding until the upper room. They go into the upper room, and then they're with Our Lady, and then our Lord appears to them. But they're all cowards. A vast majority of them are cowards. But I do think that around 2/12, 1/6 is what we could say are the ones who are truly acting in bad faith, and 1/12 of those deliberately so.
Do you think we're in a particularly low period statistically now? Or is this a formula that you see as being permanently a feature of a flawed church? Are we
Well,
worse than ever, or has it always been like this?
I think that if you go through history, you'll see that the ratio probably holds true. It just depends on who has the upper hand. So with the Arian heresy, for instance, they said that 80% of the church was Arian,
Yeah, at least
which
more.
is,
Yeah.
or even more than that, But with the Arian heresy, I think that it was really the loud bishops, the ones who were the most prominent, were still about a 12th, not even the majority. It was just the loud ones, and you had a whole bunch that were just kind of quiet and didn't really get involved. And this doesn't mean that you don't have a whole bunch of bad clergy. I think that a lot of the priests and deacons under these bishops, probably a greater majority of them were worse. And so I don't extend the ratio to the lower clergy, but I do think that by and large the same ratio of what we had at Calvary still holds.
So, in terms of loudness of voice, Lepanto has added its voice to the clamour in the church in order to clean it up. What kind of response do you get when you publicise your reports, and particularly when you say, in fact, you're giving a great deal of money to secondary agencies who have values that are entirely contrary to the Catholic Church and for the purposes the money was given?
It depends on who we're talking to. A lot of the faithful, the pew-sitting Catholics, who really are the ones that are being requested to place their funds in these different charitable organizations, they they are the ones who are very thankful for what we do because the average Joe just doesn't have time to investigate each of these charities and to see where their money is actually going. What are they involved in? Who's the leadership? That's what we do. We go into their financial records. We go into the project records. So if they're taking government money and they're implementing government projects, we examine those projects and we see exactly what it is that they're involved in. We look at their leadership. We see what their leadership believes and what they're up to. And so we put that all together for people so that they can say, okay, I don't like the fact that the leadership of this organization is involved in promoting, whatever it is, gravely immoral ideologies. But they may be willing to fund the organization because they see that the organization itself doesn't or hasn't been actively involved in such things. But it doesn't mean that it won't happen eventually. And so people make a decision. They make a choice. All we do is provide a guide. And they're very thankful for that. But I'll tell you, the organizations we profile and give negative marks to get very upset with us. And very often, a lot of the bishops in the United States anyway get very upset with us also because of the negative marks that we give to like Catholic Relief Services, the Campaign for Human Development, and so forth.
So tell me about the latest report that you just published, which is on the back of which I thought we might have this conversation. What did you establish and how's it been received?
Well, so the most recent report that we put out had to do with what are called community land trusts. A community land trust, it may or may not be a good idea. I know that the idea for it kind of cropped up out of socialist circles as they were trying to figure out how to take property off of speculative markets. And by and large, we have found that the founders of these community land trusts are either members of the Democratic Socialists of America, or they are members of the Party for Liberation and Socialism, which is even worse. It's kind of a terrorist organization. We've found that they are out in the public advocating for socialism, advocating for Marxist ideologies, even applauding Karl Marx himself, saying, oh, Marx is a great guy. We really liked what he had to say. This is a serious problem because socialism is fully condemned by the Catholic Church. What we found and what I pointed out in this report is that these CLTs, these community land trusts, were receiving funds from the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which is a program of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And so we were just exposing the fact that there seems to be a movement that is rooted in socialist ideologies. I've been since informed that there are third-way Catholics who say, look, we want to have a way of affordable housing, our own little Catholic community, and this is the way that we do it. And okay, that's fine. I'm not saying that all community land trusts are dyed-in-the-wool Marxists, but the idea for it did spring up out of socialist circles, and that's a problem, and you have to be aware of it. But with these individual CLTs that were funded by the USCCB, these were Marxist organizations, and in addition to being Marxist organizations, they were also very public in their support for, let's say, the Rainbow Movement and for the termination of young babies in the womb.
Mm. Well, of course, I mean, that's incredible, but we're immensely surprised that Catholic bishops were willing to fund agencies who pursued those kind of goals. So, when you publish these things, do the bishops do they try and close you down in any way? Do they deny it? What do they say? Look, it doesn't matter, or do they use the kind of chain of causality argument? We're giving it to people. We can't be responsible for everything they do because they deliver certain services. No one has clean hands. What kind of argument do they use to say, leave us alone and don't trouble us?
So there's a long history here. The CCHD has been around for over 55 years. It was it was begun in 1970 as a national collection and campaign of the Conference of Bishops. And since the very beginning, in 1971, there was a gentleman in the United States. He was the Secretary General of an organization called the America's Leading Families Organization. And he published a report saying that 20 or 30 of the organizations receiving funds from the CHD at the time were involved in the promotion of abortion and birth control. Now, what's interesting about that is that the immediate response from the bishop, Bishop Joseph Bernardin, who was the Secretary General of the USCCB, and his chairman of the subcommittee for the Campaign for Human Development, came out with a statement. And what they said at the time was, first they indicated that their policy, the official policy of the organization, was that they can give to organizations that are acting against church teaching as long as the funds aren't going to organizations that have I lost you? So what happened in 1971 is that Joseph Bernardin, the Secretary General of the U.S. Conference of Bishops at the time, and his chairman of the subcommittee for the Campaign for Human Development, not only did they produce a policy statement that said, well, we'll go ahead and fund organizations that are for a good project, and it's okay if they are also involved in promoting things that are against church teaching, which kind of proved the point. It said, yeah, well, what they were accused of doing, they actually were doing. And then they came out and they said, well, it's not, they even attacked their own policy. They said, it's not feasible for us to not fund organizations that are going against church teaching as long as the funding is going towards those good projects. So we have to do this kind of thing. And on top of that, it's almost like they twist the words of the individual who's putting out these reports and saying, look, there's a serious problem here. They do almost like a bait and switch. They say, okay, so we're going to set up a straw man by saying that you said that we were funding these gravely immoral things. And now we're going to beat that up and we're going to attack it. I have seen that pattern repeated over and over and over again over the last, well, I mean, I've been doing this for 15 years, but in looking at past statements, they've been saying these same things. They just don't change their talking points. Well, when I started investigating CHD and exposing the problems there, what we pointed out right away is that the CHD is violating its own guidelines. So instead of trying to make this a moral issue and just saying, look, this is what they're doing and this is why it's bad, we said, hey, the CHD has these guidelines. They say they will not fund organizations that are acting against church teaching. There's no caveat here. It's just they won't. So we point out where they are funding organizations that are attacking church teaching. And so this organization is in violation of the CCHD grant guidelines. I've met a number of times with people at the USCCB to try and explain the problems. They always come up with some excuse as to why it was okay for the funding to go through. And then they would try and say, well, we looked into it and what you had wasn't accurate. And I would say, okay, show me the evidence then, because I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to unjustly attack somebody and put out false information. Show me where I was wrong. Oh no, I can't show you that. Well, why not? Well, it's not permitted. What we discussed with these organizations was in private and I can't share it with you. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to take your word for it, and I'm certainly not going to take their word for it. You're going to have to show me the evidence. Otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead and put forward what I have. They never publish any counter evidence. In fact, at one point, the chairman or the director for the subcommittee in charge of the CCHD in Washington, D.C., he even offered me basically a bribe. He tried to get me to set up an organization that would, go and attack these organizations like Planned Parenthood and expose how they're trying to get into these poor communities. And if you set that up, yeah, we would fund that. So why don't you go ahead and set that up? In fact, I'm not supposed to, be involved and help somebody set up an organization that we would then fund. It's against the rules, but I'll make an exception. I'll help you out if that's what you would do. But don't publish your grants list. Don't publish your research. Don't publish your reports. Well, I don't know what else to call it but a bribe.
That's just incredible. So either they change what they do, their pattern of behavior, because you're calling them out on it, or you diminish the funding, or is there a third? What other outcomes are there? And do you succeed in getting them to restrain their illegitimate funding? Do you sanction them by telling people and they give less? What happens? Because you've been doing this a while now, so
Mhm.
essentially, I think I'm asking you. You're clearly successful in telling the truth, and that must be the most important part of it. Are you successful in changing any policies?
Well, when I first started doing this, I actually forced the CCHD to adopt a new policy regarding coalitions. So if an organization is a member of a coalition and that coalition has a policy position or an agenda item that attacks church teaching, well, then the grantee either has to leave the coalition or they lose funding. That's a new guideline that came out of the work that I do. Now,
Very
CHD,
good.
they disregard their own policies all the time, so they don't really care. It's on paper, but now they explain away. Well, define what a coalition membership is.
Right.
What is a coalition? What does that mean? Oh, come on. I mean, when they have coalition in the name and they're paying dues to it, I mean, that's pretty clear. But that's one thing that we got done. I have been able to convince various bishops all over the country to no longer participate in the collection. So that's also a victory. I've also been able to convince bishops that organizations that were approved for funding under their diocese, under their authority, were acting against church teaching. And as a result of that, the bishops themselves individually stood up and said, they're done. We're not funding that anymore. Get rid of them. So there are minor victories. And I do know that the collection plate has been greatly diminished because of our efforts, which is also a victory. Ultimately, what needs to happen, though, the CHD needs to be completely shut down because the whole setup is directed toward financing organizations that are political agitprop groups.
Yeah.
They're not helping the poor. All they're doing is helping political agitators go out there and push a hard left agenda. And that's where the problem lies.
Well, it sounds as though you've achieved an enormous amount, and where there are bishops who are Catholic bishops or who've got Catholic consciences, you force or you engineer a change, which is a huge achievement. Michael, for people who find themselves energized and captivated by the very important work you're doing, because I guess there aren't very many people doing this work, or
Mm.
you wouldn't be doing it. How did you get into it? What was your inspiration for it in the first place?
Well, it's kind of interesting. My grandfather back in the 1960s was actively involved in working with the California State Police and with the FBI, exposing communist cell networks in Southern California. And
So
he told me
it's in the blood. It's in your
it's
genes.
in the blood. Yeah, it's in the blood. My So he would I grew up at his feet. I mean, he would just tell me story after story after story. I learned how to recognize communists, how to see what their networks are, how to think like them, what their strategies are. I learned so much about how the Marxists take control, not only of a civil area, but a religious area as well. My grandmother, at the same time, was probably the first person to maintain a good bishops, bad bishops list. And she would put on a logbook, just the new appointments, and then she'd start reading news articles as they would come out. Well, where do they stand on this and where do they stand on that? And maintaining exactly what their positions were with regard to public policy. So growing up at their feet and learning about what happens with a Marxist attitude in society, and my father was in the Navy and he was in naval intelligence. I learned an awful lot about investigation through him. I was formally trained by a naval intelligence analyst in open resource analysis. So I learned about what it takes to not only put out a risk analysis and say, okay, this organization is a risk to deal with. They might be a risk for activity involved in X, Y, and Z, but also maintaining a high level of proof. So when we look for what the organizations are involved in, we always go with primary sources. If we see that the leadership of an organization is involved with or individually promoting extremely evil ideologies, chances are the organization is going to follow suit. It's, where the head goes, the rest of the body follows. So we maintain a high level of a high standard of proof before we put out any information. That's why we've never been sued, because we always make sure that everything is primary sources. There's no inference. There's no guilt by association. It's just direct evidence to show that these organizations are involved in these horrible things. And it's kind of how it developed. It's just organic over time, but it's almost like God said, well, I'm going to move you over here and have you work on these things, and this is how I want you to work.
I think that's the most amazing story. I've got two questions because I don't want to lose sight of either of them. Do you extend your profiling and keep your grandmother's good bishops, bad bishops list? Do as an institute, do you do profiling in terms of what kind of bishops they are? And the other thing is a private question in my question. Over the years, I keep on reading anecdotal stories of infiltration by Marxists into various organizations, but particularly the Catholic Church. And we are told anecdotally that groups of people who were Marxists present themselves for ordination, insert themselves into an organization with a deliberate intent of subverting it from as part of the Marxist ideology. Is this true? Do we have any real evidence? It seems to me to be a highly sacrificial and ideological thing for somebody to do. But is it true? Do you have any evidence of that, since this is your area of expertise? So first of all, do you do your grandmother's profiling of bishops, and what's the reality behind this anecdotal stuff?
So earlier on, when I first got involved in this work, I did have a list of bishops that I was monitoring based on the question of Canon 915. Are they willing to deny communion to pro-abortion politicians, right, and so forth? And I did maintain for a long time a list within the United States. Obviously, going outside the United States, things get more difficult. But for a while, I did maintain a list. But as I got involved with examining charitable organizations, and as the bishops that I'd met with and corresponded with either retired or died off, I've fallen away from maintaining that list. I just haven't had time.
Sure.
But so yeah, I mean, unofficially, I have kind of a running tally in my head, but I don't have anything official on paper.
So let me, before you come to the anecdotal stuff, because this links in, the appointment of bishops is a critical way of determining the nature of the church, and different popes will have different priorities. What's your view in terms of the trajectory of the quality of bishops? You've been doing this now for nearly 2 decades.
Yeah.
Is it getting better, worse? Is it steady state? What's the level of episcopal competence or even Catholic integrity, as far as in terms of trajectory as you see it?
I think that over the last 12 years, we have had some of the worst episcopal appointments I've ever seen.
Wow.
It's been absolutely abysmal, and the effects have been dramatic. We are now seeing, at least in the United States, with the appointment of Bishop Martin in North Carolina, with the appointment of Archbishop Weisenberger in Detroit, Cardinal Supich in Chicago, McElroy in Washington, D.C. All of these appointments have been extremely detrimental to the faith and the faithful in those dioceses. Those who wish to maintain pious practices are being put under the thumb. They're being pushed down and oppressed, and heterodoxy is being elevated and lauded as the practice of the church. So it's a very serious problem, and I think that things are pretty dark right now in terms of episcopal appointments.
So, Michael, help me out. I'm busy trying to make people become Catholics. I've got quite a lot of friends in my wake who look at what I and others have done and are thinking about it. And one of the things they say is, well, we're not altogether sure it's safe to become Catholic, because they seem to be behaving just as badly as some of the bishops we're considering fleeing in liberal Episcopalianism. How do you keep yourself a faithful, hopeful Catholic in the face of episcopal suboptimal performance?
I follow the words of St. Peter. Lord, where shall we go? Our Lord asked, will you leave also? This is a hard saying, Peter said. This is a hard saying. Where shall we go? So I think that you don't abandon Christ because of the sins of Peter and Judas. Even more to the point, I would say, in terms of people that I know that have come into the church, my first reaction is, welcome to the faith. Here's your sword. Welcome to the trenches. Get fighting.
Yeah, that's
Because we
right.
are in a fight,
Yeah.
and nothing worth having is easy. So I think that we're fighting for the soul of the church, and we're fighting for the faithful souls around us. And once you recognize that what the Catholic Church professes and what she teaches and what she does is the truth, and there is no other, anything that falls away from that is an untruth, it's a lie, well, then where else can you go? You don't jump ship because there's a mutiny on board while you've got a raging storm on the outside of the ship. You just don't jump overboard. So I think that you have to take your chances, fight where you are, and just recognize that as long as you remain grounded in the truth, everything that the church actually teaches, and avoid novelty, you'll be fine. Even if you're oppressed, even if you have episcopal appointments that oppress and suppress and persecute you, I even more merit to be had because we pray for our persecutors, we pray for our oppressors, and we look for a time when they also will have salvation because somebody was praying for them. So yeah, get in the fight, get involved. The Catholic faith is about getting your hands bloody.
Yes, and that's exactly right. I'm very grateful for the Augustine and the Donatist controversy, because this means that however badly performing the clergy are, their corruption doesn't affect the integrity of the
Right.
sacrament which we're given, which is enormously important. And the fact is too that, as you quite rightly say, um, the uh, the other denominations don't have the promise of Christ that the gates of hell won't prevail against them. So, if we're
Right.
going to fight corruption, this is the place to do it, because this is the place where it matters most. So, it's so the work you're doing is enormously important. I don't want to lose sight of the anecdotal evidence about people slipping in deliberately to Marxify the church. Is there any evidence of that, or do they were they Marxists when they came and they do it as a kind of they've never been converted, or do they slip into Marxism because they're spiritually inept and they're looking for levers to pull, or did they always intend to do this?
So it's interesting that you asked this question. I researched this very thoroughly a couple of years ago. I went through newspaper archives going back to the 1920s. And what I discovered is that there were news reports coming out where Moscow intentionally created an entire agency designed to encourage young men to join the clergy so that they could become Catholics and infiltrate the church from within. During the 1930s, it was Archbishop, or at the time it was Father Fulton Sheen, who put out a statement that he had solid evidence himself, saying that there was a concerted effort and an order from Moscow to encourage criminals and Marxists to join the clergy to corrupt the church. We know that there's a program called the Alta Vendita, which was a Masonic blueprint for infiltrating the church. This goes back to the 1800s. And this Masonic blueprint said, we want young men to join the clergy. They will maintain for themselves great reputations as being very pious and as being patriots. And they will rise through the ranks before they start introducing the false ideologies that we wish them to introduce. And if you understand that there is a clear relationship between Marxist ideologies and Masonic ideologies, then this makes perfect sense. So you have that infiltration that goes back to the Alta Vendita. You've got the Soviet program to introduce Marxists into the church. And, it goes hand in hand also with the corruption of theology, where the modernists in the late 1700s, early 1900s, or I'm sorry, late 1800s, early 1900s, were corrupting the faith foundations that we have in the Catholic Church, and they were rightly suppressed by Pius X. They went underground. They reinvented themselves as the Nouveau Théologie, and then got themselves appointed as Periti at the Second Vatican Council. So you have then from that point forward this injection of corrupt theology, as they had their suppressions lifted just prior to the council, and they went out into the public. You know, Hans Kung and Yves Congar and Henri de Lubac, and Hans Urs von Balthasar and Edward Schielebeck. These guys went out and they started spreading their bad ideologies, their bad theology, unopposed. You know, they didn't have anybody saying, you can't talk, you can't do this, you can't do that. They went out and they spread their ideologies. And that aided and abetted the Marxists as they were also attempting to shift the theological understanding of the church. In fact, in the 1960s, it was 1950s or 1960s, there was a KGB program that was created in Romania to create what we now come to understand as liberation theology. And the reason they did it in Romania is because the language of Romania is the closest to Spanish. And so they were training theologians in Romania in this new liberation theology, which is a Marxist ideology, to go into seminaries down in South America to spread that idea in the seminaries, to then also spread it as priests in the area, which liberation theologians down in South America, they got in bed with the Marxist revolutionaries, told the people, no, it's great. You have to rise up against oppression because that's what Christ came as a liberator to free us from the oppressors. That's what the faith is all about. And that in turn became Marxist revolution after Marxist revolution through the Catholic Church. So yeah, there's plenty of evidence that the Marxists really did get in and that they really did capture key positions to spread their false ideologies.
Before I became a Catholic, I read several books on the bad popes, so I wouldn't have any improper expectations. But I also read Taylor Marshall's Infiltration and was very interested in the evidence he presented about the St. Gallen mafia. What's your take on his analysis of the St. Gallen mafia plot?
Well, I think that there's something to it. Getting direct evidence is very hard, simply because we only have the statements that came from men who claim to have been there, whether it's Danneels, Cardinal Danneels. You've got Cardinal Martini, who was allegedly part of that, and of course, Jorge Bergoglio. You have Cardinal McElroy, who was also a part of it. And they've dropped hints here and there, and they've said, we did this in St. Gallen, or we were a part of I think Danneels actually referred to it as the St. Gallen Mafia. So you have their statements, and that does give a clear indication that something happened. What else is interesting is that St. Gallen is an area that is heavily influenced by the Freemasons, and they did have a stronghold of communist intelligence agents. There was an intelligence agency in St. Gallen as they were trying to coordinate their disinformation campaigns, whether in the church or in society. So I think that it's definitely linked, and I think there's evidence to support it. The problem is there isn't really direct proof other than the statements that I just mentioned.
And I think people would love to hear what your take is on the papal succession. So there are optimists about Pope Leo, and there are realists and pessimists. How do you see the way in which his allegiance is pledged?
Well, I look at it. I look at it the same way that I view the election of Pius IX. Pope Pius IX was elected as a liberal. He had a reputation for being a liberal, for being liberated in his thinking. And there were also rumors that he was a Freemason. In fact, after his election, and he suppressed Freemasonry once he became the Pope, put out formal condemnations of Freemasonry. There was a Masonic lodge that issued a formal excommunication of the Pope. So that happened. And they said before he was elected, he was a member of our lodge, and we now formally excommunicate him from our lodge. That only happens if you're a member. So you keep in mind, Pope Pius IX, he was elected as a liberal and as a rumored Freemason. And what did he do? He entered into his papacy, and he still had kind of a broad view liberal mindset, but something changed. Something happened. And he immediately flipped on the liberals. He put out the syllabus of errors, demolishing liberal ideologies and saying that these are now condemned propositions. He wrote incredibly strong encyclicals against Freemasonry, forbade Catholics from being members of Freemasons and excommunicated members. So I think that we can look at the election of Pope Leo XIV with the same kind of hope. I won't say that he'll change his mindset. I won't say that this is necessarily going to happen. There is grace of office that comes with an election. And when we look at his background is definitely liberal, and it's problematic, deeply theologically problematic. But does that mean that he himself cannot be transformed by the office, cannot be influenced by the grace of office, and won't be protected from introducing grave error into the teachings of the church? Well, I think that we have the promise of Christ. I have prayed for you, Peter by name, but also that the church will not fall into grave error because of the Pope, even if he does introduce bad programs like synodality and allows for heterodoxy to spread without standing up and stopping it. Those will be things that he'll answer to Christ for. We don't need to judge him for that, but we have to be aware of the programs that'll come up under his papacy, whether it's something that he initiates or something that comes out from the people in authority under him. But I'm not convinced that he is an anti-pope, as some seem to have deemed him. I think that it's dangerous to try and go down that road because we don't really have the authority to make that declaration. So it's best to simply understand that the papacy comes with two roles. He is a human man who has human thoughts, human feelings, and human dispositions. And he is in the office of the papacy, which itself is protected by Christ. So if we look at it from that perspective, we can say that as a man, he can be full of error. And that has happened many times in the papacy. Just look through the history of the papacy. There have been popes that have said in their private settings things that are way off. This is probably why it's not a good idea to have press conferences and interview all the time, because he's not speaking officially. He's speaking off the cuff. It's his opinion when he does these things. And opinions are dangerous. Just ask Peter. Peter had some dangerous opinions too, like forcing converts to get circumcised. That was a dangerous ideology, and he was confronted for it. But again, I'm not convinced that he's not the Pope. I'm not convinced that he won't be the Pope, that he could fall into heretical ideas and therefore lose the papacy. And even if that happens, who among us has the ability to make that declaration? And the answer is none of us. We have to simply wait, pray, fast. Why did Our Lady ask for so many prayers for the Pope? Consistently. Since Fatima, it's been pray for the Pope, pray for the Pope, pray the rosary for the Pope, ask for prayers for the Pope. Why? Well, I think now we're seeing why. And we have to recognize that our prayers, the graces that we call for the papacy through our sacrifices and our prayers, do have an effect, a real effect. And if we don't do that things become so much worse. So pray for him. Pray for him incessantly, always, constantly. And God will do the rest. Don't worry about it.
Michael, that's a great note to end on. I know that people would want me to thank you for everything you've done personally and all the expertise you've brought, including your family history. And thank you for the Lepanto Institute. Thank you for being so generous with your time. We've had about, 3 breakdowns of internet since we began this conversation. So we got a sense that actually we must be doing something really quite valuable to attract that level of electronic and pneumatic opposition. Michael, thank you very much indeed. God bless you.
Thanks so much for having me on. God bless you too.
Thank you.